I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism here at Birkbeck, and I'd like to welcome you all here this evening. The Pears Institute is a new institute established only last year, and it takes its remit up, obviously, as its name says, the study of anti-Semitism, but also the study of anti-Semitism in the context of other racisms and other forms of intolerance, and in the present as well as in the past. Although this evening, a lot of what we will be talking about, I'm sure, is going to be about the past, or the past in the present. And this evening's event at this round table is the first in what I hope is going to be a series of events under the title Disciplining Anti-Semitisms, which tries to explore the ways in which different disciplines or interdisciplinary approaches deal with the phenomenon of anti-Semitism and of racism more broadly. And I'm delighted, really delighted, that we are going to kick this off this evening with a discussion of Anthony Bale's recent book, Feeling Persecuted, Christians, Jews and Images of Violence, or a discussion which starts off from his recent book. Anthony, as many of you will know, is located professionally, at least here at Birkbeck, in the Department of English and Humanities, and he has written not only this book but also a book called "The Jew in the Medieval Book: English Anti-Semitisms 1350 to 1500." And after Anthony speaks, we will also have John Arnold from the History Department here at Birkbeck. John is also a medieval specialist who has written widely on the history of heresy, but he has also written extremely widely and thoughtfully and provocatively on the theory and practice of writing history. And our third speaker is Nadia Wallman, from the Department of English at Queen Mary University of London. Nadia has written brilliantly on representations of Jews, of the Jewess in particular, in Victorian and Edwardian Britain. And after they have spoken, I hope that we will then sort of open things up to a more open discussion, in which you two will get every opportunity to speak and discuss the issues at hand. But to start us off,
I'm going to have to kind of move between here and the computer to show you some images I've brought along. It's great to see so many people here interested in this difficult topic, so thank you for coming. Also, thank you to David and to Jan for organising this evening's event with great aplomb. Okay, so you'll be relieved to know that I'm not going to give a paper now. I'm just going to suggest some ideas and some thoughts and some provocations. And these are partly based on the material in my recent book. And I'll show you some of what I think are the most interesting pictures from the book. So David's has given the title this evening, Interpreting Imaginary Jews. And this is one of the events, as David said, in the Pears Centre for the Study of Anti-Semitism. Now, from my perspective as a scholar of English literature and English culture, all Jews represented in anti-Semitism are imaginary. Not the Jews affected by anti-Semitism necessarily, but the Jews represented in it. And one of the quotations I found very useful in writing the book was some of the work by Hannah Arendt, the German-American philosopher. And in her very brilliant but somewhat uneven book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says that anti-Semitism is an outrage against common sense. And this kind of connected to me the kind of imaginary Jews. What Arendt was suggesting, I think, was that we can't use reason or fact or ideas of truth when we think about anti-Semitism, because one of the points about anti-Semitism is that it's outrageously false. That's one of the things which makes a representation of a Jew anti-Semitic, is its falseness or its unreasonableness, or its imaginary nature. Otherwise it would just be observation or reportage. But some of the Jews of anti-Semitism are more imaginary than others. And the Jews from medieval English culture, I think, are necessarily amongst the most imaginary. I'm going to say a few words about the context of medieval England, which is my specialised area. The Jews came to England with the Normans who arrived in the 11th century after the Norman conquest of 1066. And they lived mainly in the south of England and east of England and were expelled by Edward I in 1290. Between 1290 and the 17th century, mid-17th century, there was no observable or observant Jewish community in England. So we're given a unique, for a scholar of the past, there's a unique context in which there's no real Jews to be the subject of anti-Semitic representations. And this gives a very intriguing and methodological situation for trying to understand what representations of Jews are doing. So, and I can talk at more length later about why the Jews were expelled if anyone's interested in that, or what difference the expulsion might make to the representation of them. But whilst the Jews physically disappear from England, and they do seem largely to have been absent between 1290 and the 17th century, in material, kind of fleshly, human form, they don't disappear from English culture. And in fact, they remain incredibly frequently discussed, depicted, represented in all kinds of media. Now, there have been two main modes of interpreting what these representations of Jews are doing. One has been in the history of anti-Semitism, in inverted commas, which basically says that Europe was always anti-Semitic, Christian Europe was always anti-Semitic, and this is the kind of longest hatred model, or the generic hatred model, or a kind of way of seeing the past which suggests that there was always anti-Semitism, and it's always the same in different historical periods, and the English Jews were part of that, and the representation of the English Jews was part of that history. The other main approach has been through the language of psychoanalysis, suggesting that the Jewish other represents the kind of doubts or anxieties or kind of spectral preoccupations of Christianity, and the Jews were the kind of outgroup onto which these doubts were displaced. And what I've tried to do in my work more generally is sidestep these two approaches, one of the kind of longest hatred model and one of psychoanalysis, and think much more about the original audience of anti-Semitism and how they might have interpreted representations of Jews, what representations of Jews meant to Christians in their specific contexts. And this means looking at context not only in historical terms, but looking at the cultural context in which representations appeared. So the precise books, images, the churches, the scribes, the very specific micro-contexts. Why were people writing about Jews when they weren't present? So where do we find these imaginary Jews in medieval England? What are they getting up to? And who was interested in them? Well, the answer is we find them everywhere, and almost everyone seems to have been interested in them. I'll give you a few examples very quickly. Very common strand of imagery, Jews attacking the Eucharist, the host. Here from a 15th century book, you can see these two Jews busily stabbing a table which has got the Eucharist on it. You can't really see it in the centre, but what you can see is it bleeding. Okay, so on the one hand, the Jews are attacking the Christian symbol. On the other hand, they're actually proving its Christian sanctity by showing that it's the body and blood of Christ by their heresy. So this would kind of feed into that psychoanalytic approach of this being resolving Christian doubts about the efficacy and the sanctity of the Eucharist, and they're doing that through these imaginary Jews. Another very common strand of imagery here, there's a group of Jews wearing these funny hats with kind of misshapen faces, attacking a little boy here, strung up in mockery of the crucifixion. This is William of Norwich, the first blood libel boy martyr. He was martyred in the 12th century, in the early 12th century, but this image comes from the 15th century. And you can't really see in this image, but there's been some kind of genital attack going on there as well, of unspecified nature. But this is a very, very common set of images to do with little boys being killed by Jews. And it's a kind of miniature domestic repetition of Christ's passion, happening in kind of, in a very miniaturized, intimate form. And in terms of the Passion, from the 12th century onwards, the Passion became more and more defined as a specifically Jewish crime. And the complicated and ambivalent story from the Bible of how Christ came to be crucified became increasingly more and more a specifically Jews versus Christ depiction. And in most medieval churches, you'll find imagery which very graphically shows Jews involved in the Passion. In fact, on the front of my book, there's a good picture of that. Okay, so in poetry and drama, in visual culture, in sermons, in historical chronicles, we find these imaginary Jews appearing in late medieval culture. And this shouldn't really surprise us that there weren't any Jews around, because the imagination always is interested in what's absent. It doesn't have to be justified to what's present. Which is how I kind of approach this from a literary perspective. Okay, so when I started doing the research, which eventually became both my books, when I was a PhD student, one of my working assumptions was that representations would change around 1290 once the Jews had been expelled. This turned out very quickly to be nonsense, and I had to abandon this hypothesis because the Jews were basically absent from lots of what was being said about them beforehand anyway. So as I said, I focused instead on the micro contexts of where and how imaginary Jews were being evoked. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through one image from the book now. This is from a very famous medieval manuscript, the Luttrell Psalter. Some of you might have seen some close-ups of this on BBC 4 the other night in the History of the Book series. It's a very magnificent, very luxurious book in the British Library, made for a Lincolnshire gentleman called Sir Geoffrey Luttrell in the mid-14th century, so about 60 or 70 years after the Jews had been expelled. And what we've got here is what seems on first sight to be an absolutely perfect example of medieval anti-Semitism. You've got these two Jews at the bottom striking Christ with flails at the flagellation. And they have got these kind of misshapen faces depicted in profile. They've got various signs of evil, the kind of high forehead, the party-coloured clothes, and they're engaged in this, and the dark skin of the Jew on this side. And they're engaged in this kind of graphic violence against Christ's body, who in contrast is very white, very passive, very vulnerable. And those of you who are close up will see there's little red spots of blood on his body. So it's flagrantly untruthful, unfairly violent, and given that the Jews weren't present, it endows them with all this agency in attacking Christ's body. So it seems to be kind of in a very basic way anti-Semitic. Now, one of the scholars who's written about this, Michael Camille, who's a well-known scholar of medieval marginalia and medieval art, he suggests that this kind of image of the Jews in the book is because Geoffrey Luttrell, who had the book made. His grandfather had been indebted to the Jews of Lincoln and London. And this is a kind of what he calls an ancestral grudge against the Jews from 60 or 70 years before. Actually, the image of the Jews here makes sense in its context in the book. The text here, you'll see, says, "Ne timoeris," don't be afraid. The text is from Psalm 48, and actually the book is full of what's called in the Middle Ages imagines verborum, kind of pictures of the words which bring out the meaning of the text which they accompany. And Psalm 48 is an invective against worldly things, the folly of worldlings who live on in sin without thinking of death or hell. So Psalm 48 is all about kind of trusting in the flesh, not in the spirit. And of course, the crucifixion is also concerned with that. So, and actually on the accompanying pages, which also have Psalm 48 on them, there's a whole passion sequence of Jews torturing Christ in different ways. So this kind of image seeks to associate the Jews with the flesh and the imposition of violence, as opposed to the spirit, which is Christ. And Jews, and this is kind of a theme, Jews are understood as physically powerful. Christians assume physical weakness, even if they also have spiritual strength. So this image, I think, coming from the 1350s, offers a very neat example of how Jewish violent agency, the imaginary Jew, the violent Jew, was created and represented and re-energized not long after the Jews had been expelled. And so the actual weakness of the historical Jewish community of England is then reimagined and refound as Jewish strength and the Christian assumption of holy weakness. So we also have here a very memorable image, which helps us remember what the psalm is talking about through violent contrast. And what I spend a lot of time in my book talking about is the kind of aesthetic ideas of how you get to feel an image in medieval theories of reading. Medieval people held that an image kind of enters the eye and then is imprinted on the sensitive part of the brain in a very physical and quite painful idea of the reception of knowledge. And through looking at violent images, that was the best way to remember something and to imprint something on one's mind. And the representation of Jews against Christians, particularly this idea of grotesquerie and violent contrast, is very much indebted to those ideas of mnemonic efficacy and mnemonic efficiency. Okay, how long have I spoken for? Can I have another couple of minutes? What I want to do now is actually look at a very different artifact and a very different thing, and just talk for a few minutes about a Jewish book. One of the reviews of my first book took me to task for talking only about Christian representations of Jews and said, where are the Jews here? Where are the real Jews? So I picked up this challenge for this book, and I looked at a medieval Hebrew book, a Haggadah, a Passover festival book, from Spain. And it's a really fascinating, beautiful book, and I haven't got time to talk about it in any, to do it real justice now. But what I used the Prato Haggadah for is to think about how Jews also can misrepresent themselves and how the history of anti-Semitism often misrepresents Jews. So I'll just talk through the book very briefly. So as I said, it's a festival book for Passover. So it would have been used by a family and returned to over and over again each year. And it tells the story of Exodus, basically. And throughout the book, there's these hybrids and grotesques and amazingly decorated borders which wrap themselves around the Hebrew text. And that these creatures are very similar to the things that we're used to seeing in cathedrals, gargoyles and that kind of thing. And in the Prato Haggadah, in the margins, there's this amazing sequence of scenes of hunting. So I'll just show you them. Here you've got a dog, a silver dog, starting to chase deer, right? And it's on the first page, so it's the start of the chase, so it fits. This is very faint. The dog reappears here, and then there's this very cute hare standing on the leaves at the side. The dog is chasing. Here the dog is perplexed and is looking backwards. And this works very nicely in the book because, of course, we're reading from right to left, so the dog is looking backwards when the reader is going forwards. Here, the dog has got the deer and has jumped on its back and is ripping a hole in its flesh. You see, the deer has gone very faint because the deer was painted in different ink from the dog when that's stayed. Oh, and the hare is sitting here again, watching, cheekily. Dog on that side, jumping over to this page where the hare is still looking at the dog. Dog chasing the hare again, who's jumping out of the page. And then the hare is finally caught by a man. He's got an arrow in his side, and the man, the archer, is shooting again at the hare. Okay, so the hunting imagery is really, really unusual and really striking. Mainly, on first sight, because we know that Jews didn't hunt in the kind of ritualized, courtly form that Christians did. So why have they got hunting in their Passover book? Also, in using imagery of violence, hunting, pursuit, victimhood, victimization, all those hallmarks of the Jewish experience in medieval Europe, is the Jewish community here representing itself as a trapped minority, a kind of quarry of the Christians, persecuted into the corner of its pages? Also, those of you who are aware of what dogs and hares kind of mean in terms of Jewish purity will be wondering, why are there non-kosher animals running through this Jewish festival book, which is a very precious, luxurious thing? Now, the three interpretations of this book, have said either the images mean nothing, they're just decoration, and nothing in a manuscript as laboriously beautiful as this is just decorative. The second one is that Christian artists put these images there to humiliate their rich Jewish patrons, and it's a kind of anti-Semitic way of getting at the Jewish patron. And third is that the Jews put these there as subversive representations of the cruelty and violence of their Christian neighbours. Okay, so just to conclude, and I'll stop talking in a second. Basically, I'd argue that by using the category of anti-Semitism to understand this book, we're totally misunderstanding what the book's doing. The hunt moves us through the book along with the story of Exodus, and it makes total sense in terms of the story of Exodus, which is, of course, a story of pursuit, a story of the weak suddenly assuming power freakishly through strange events in the desert. And it helps us, just like the literal Psalter image, remember key sentiments at key moments in the text. And I won't talk about the text much here because it would require lots of translation from the Hebrew. But a description of the growth of Israel in the Exodus story is accompanied by its persecution. And so this makes entire sense in terms of the marginalia. So at the point where the hare is caught, this is with a text of a psalm here. This is Psalm 118, verse 5. The Lord is on my side, I have no fear. What can man do to me? So it makes perfect sense, read as an imagines verborum kind of thing. Okay, so just as in Christian sources, the idea of pain, the aesthetic idea of pain, animated one's devotional self. That's how you became one's devotional self. That's how you became a devotional person, is by thinking about pain and thinking about victimhood. What it doesn't mean is that it represents one's own victimhood. It represents a kind of cosmic, much larger history of victimhood. And perhaps I'll finish on a controversial note. This kind of imagery is very common in Christian books from the same time of hunting in Latin manuscripts. And so there's definitely a diaspora interplay here, an intertextuality and kind of commingling between imagery. But also, might not this book... But I should say, the book is unfinished, and an image like this was not actually coloured in. And one scholar who's worked on it has said, this must be because the Jewish family who had it made for them were then subject to some kind of horrible change of fortune, and they couldn't have it completed, and it, was made unavailable to them. But I think it's obviously such a luxurious book that we might see the book much more as an assertion of the Jews' status who had it made. It's much more actually a memory of persecution rather than a record of persecution. And it suggests their aestheticization of those memories. Okay, so imaginary Jews. I just want to finish with a quotation from Susan Sontag, who I think is a very undervalued kind of critic. And she says in one of her essays, I think it's in Fascinating Fascism, for 2,000 years it has been spiritually fashionable amongst Jews and Christians to be in pain. And I really like this idea of the fashion for pain existing actually quite separate from the much more tragic and much more difficult story of the imposition of pain. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to this occasion. It's slightly hard for Nadia and myself, who've read every page of Anthony's excellent book, it's slightly hard for us to remember that you haven't, or presumably, yet read every page of Anthony's excellent book, although I believe there are copies over there at a discounted price. So maybe you will do so. I wanted to begin. I'm currently working on things to do with southern France in the High Middle Ages, and southern France being a region where Jewish communities of quite considerable size in some areas are present more continuously through this period, in strong contrast to medieval England, as Anthony was saying. One of the sources I was reading recently is a collection of preaching exemplar, that is, little stories collected together for the use particularly by mendicant preachers when they're giving a sermon. They want a nice little story to use to capture the audience's imagination. I didn't do it. I ought to now go back and look carefully. I think, interestingly, Jews are present in those stories, but not particularly present. And where they are present, they're often, despite the fact that we know that they're right there in the communities where these preaching stories are developed, they're often asserted as far away. So a bishop in Germany got too involved with Jews, it says, rather, not thinking about the fact that 50 yards down the road in Marseille there's a vast Jewish community also under the protection of his bishop. But so I ought to go back and do some work there. But anyway, the point is, one of the stories there, really, having read Anthony's book, I came back to it. It's not a story about Jews, but it is a story about pain. A young man who is dissolute, remembering he's a preaching exemplar, so to make us all better. A dissolute young man is repeatedly encouraged to go and make confession, which he fails to do. He wakes up one morning and discovers that his body feels as if it is on fire. In fact, he says, the text then says, in fact, not just as if it's on fire, his body feels as if it was fire. That is, it's not just being done to him, but he's sort of embodying it. And his family and friends say, what can we do to help you? What can we do? And nothing, I'm damned, I am fire, I'm consumed. And he prays with all his might to God to say, please, 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 please let me have my body back so that I can subject it to real bodily penances to try to get out of this awful kind of transcendent penance I'm doing. And Christ appears to him. And interestingly, Christ the King, not Christ the suffering Christ, but Christ the King, says, you brought it on yourself. I'm not doing anything for you. And then Mary appears and says, oh, can we not give him a second chance? And Christ the King says, you do what you want. I'm off. And he's then re-embodied and is able to do penance. It's the interest in pain, in that sense of pain and suffering, and this sort of transcendent pain and suffering, and used as a story and as example. Again, of the exemplar that I read, this one has really stuck in my head because I think it is an extraordinary image. The person who becomes fire. And that you can see how this idea of violence, which Anthony talks about in his book, as a memory imprint, has a great utility. At the same time, it's making me think about how, as I think Anthony's book invites ones to do, to read out from his specific examples, which are focused on mostly focused on Jewish persecutors of Christ, where the reader is invited to sort of think about themselves suffering along with Christ. But to think out from that, to pick images of suffering and persecution and these bodily feelings in general. Anthony's book is an absolute pleasure to read, and it's an extraordinary mixture of great scholarship and great accessibility. He was telling Nadia and myself beforehand about the press that it's published with has a particular idea of how to make scholarship more broadly address a broader audience, and I think it does that excellently well. So when you read this, you're in the presence of somebody who knows at a fantastically sophisticated level how to work with manuscript, with imagery, with literature, with history, how to read things very closely and thoughtfully, but also how to place them in large and meaningful contexts, how to write about them extremely evocatively, but also how to find little moments of humour amidst the blackness, and how to make it clearly important to all of us, not just to medievalists like myself, but to all of us who want to think about how it is that human beings interact in the world, and the politics of how we remember things, and how the politics of how we think about violence. And it makes contributions, therefore, as I would see it, to three overlapping areas. Obviously, it is a contribution to the history of anti-Semitism, and again, I think it's really worth emphasising this point about the not well thought through nature hitherto of anti-Semitism in late medieval England, where there are no Jews to whom you can be actually practically anti-Semitic. Even before the expulsion of the Jews, the Jewish communities in England were very small. They had at various points a horrendous time, but they were not. It wasn't that every medieval English Christian could find Jews to whom they could be nasty, because they only existed in certain key cities. Again, this in contrast to, say, southern France or Spain, where Jewish communities were much more prevalent, and there's a different kind of history there. So what anti-Semitism is doing in late medieval England, and what it's doing in texts that remain still famous for us today, like in Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it has to prompt questions which have to go beyond simply saying, well, they were all Christians and therefore they were anti-Semitic. It has to make us think about the nature of that hatred. So it's a contribution to history of anti-Semitism. It's also a contribution to the history of Christianity, because it's a fantastic. It evokes this fantastic sense of how, particularly looking at images, but also texts, prompts and encourages certain kind of performances of piety, certain practices of spirituality, of identifying or of looking at and thinking about the nature of a suffering Christ, and of reading oneself potentially back into a sacred history, and therefore these sort of very curious things that are happening about historical time in medieval text as well. Occasionally you find people who think that medieval people had no sense of time or history. That's all complete and utter rubbish. They had a perfectly good sense of time and history. They knew that the things that you read about in the Bible happened in antiquity. They knew there was an early church, but at the same time they were capable of evoking them in that sense in which they made them present, and I think Anthony brings that fantastically well to the fore. And I'm going to steal various of his ideas when I come to write my next book. And thirdly, I think that Anthony's contributed here hugely to an area which is one of those kind of key, well, I won't say fad, but an area of current interest, which is the history of emotions, on which I should say I've perpetrated work as well. Lots of the history of emotions work is, I think, is basically rather poor. That is, I think it gets hung up on thinking about the specifics of an emotion and sort of looking around for examples of it. Anthony, again, in this book, gets one to think about actual mechanisms of emotion and the ways in which they're situated and linked to, again, forms of piety, forms of identity, and in a modern sense, forms of politics. So it's emotion as something which is part of much more important, broader things, not just a fear as an emotion in general, but specific and situated senses of emotion. So those are various reasons why I think you ought to read this book. There are three and a half things arising from it which I wanted to throw out, all of which lead on from the sort of Anthony focusing on anti-Semitic imagery, but what he has to say, I think, leads us more broadly. So I throw these out. Anthony may want to respond later, or others, but anyway, they're thoughts in my head. As I said with the opening story of The Man on Fire, feeling persecuted and feeling pain towards one in the benefit of being spiritual. I think Sontag is actually wrong to say that it was fashionable for 2,000 years. I think it's probably fashionable for after about 1200. That is, I think that there's there is a development, particularly with regard to a wider lay audience, of the point at which inviting people to think about that kind of penitential, suffering performance of piety comes into view. There's a book by an American woman called Christine Caldwell Ames about medieval inquisitors, which is called Righteous Persecution. We have feeling persecuted, we have righteous persecution. And part of what she argues is that what particularly Dominican inquisitors were doing was extending to a lay audience the benefits of being penitential in a way which had up until then only been limited to a tiny monastic audience. So part of what I think the imagery that Anthony's interested in comes out of is a further and late medieval development of a particular kind of lay piety. What I'm interested in then is whether it's also particularly linked to a rather elite performance of lay piety. That is, both in one sense, it has to be when we're talking about illuminated manuscripts because they were only owned by quite rich people. But in another sense, whether or not we're talking about social status, whether having something which allowed you to commune with the suffering Christ, whether that was a kind of, quotidian workaday image, or whether that was something which you aspired to if you were trying to be really particularly spiritually special. I don't know, but I'm curious. Second thing is, I was thinking about the fact that there are a couple of counter discourses in medieval culture to the kind of cultural work that Anthony points to. One is voiced by people labelled as heretics recurrently through the Middle Ages, which is the where people say, why on earth do we worship the cross? When the cross was the thing on which Christ was killed. It's like if your brother was hanged, then going around and keeping the noose. Why? So there's one strand of unorthodox Christianity which explicitly pushes against the sort of core iconographic foundations of this, and I'm intrigued by how we think about that one. And the other counter discourse, or sort of balanced discourse I was thinking about, is in medieval culture where lay people are upbraided through their bad behaviour, particularly through blaspheming or swearing, through that what they do makes Christ suffer. So there's stories about through swearing on God's limbs, you then have a vision of Christ sort of broken. So in which case those Christians are sort of the Jews in this, so there's an interesting another way in which the prism turns around. It's not against Anthony's arguments, it's sort of another working through it which intrigues me. The third thing is, pleasingly, because I'm a fan of them as well, Anthony at various points talks about modern horror movies in the book and the way in which, to make you think about the fact that people can look at horrific stuff and be getting something out of it which is a bit more complicated than just hatred or fear. At the same time, it made me wonder about how medieval people looked at the suffering Christ, in particular those images of Christ suffering. That is, when they looked at it, did they identify with Christ? Did they read themselves into Christ's position? Or did they place themselves in a kind of proximate relationship to Christ? Did they say, did they try to imagine themselves not in Christ's position, but sort of near to, or in relationship to, or with, in some way? This is something where in lots of readings, I mean, you're not making use of film theory in your book and such, but the readings that draw on film theory for medieval stuff, I always wonder, is it the same kind of audience work or not? And if so, how do they use those images? Those are the three main things. There's just one last thing which was occurring to me as we were talking, because part of the point of the book, as you've heard, is to say that the history of anti-Semitism is a complex history and has to deal with the fact that some of the time anti-Semitism is not particularly about real Jews, it's about other cultural work that's going on. But a key question I will therefore be for a future research project, in in what contexts then does this kind of the sort of myth pool of anti-Semitic Christian stories, at what points and in what context does it get used and deployed in this way? In southern Europe, in Spain, we have large Jewish communities living alongside Christians in differing relationships. In late 14th century Spain, amongst other things, we have a very strenuous preaching mission by Vincent Ferre, is he Dominican? I think he's a Dominican friar. Denouncing, amongst other things, denouncing Jews. You cannot be a good Christian if you have a Jewish neighbour, drawing upon these things. And the history of the Jews in late medieval Spain is again one of forced mass conversion, forced expulsion, violence, and practiced hatred. So I'm curious at the same time, having, I think it's very important to think about anti-Semitism in the absence of Jews, but at the same time we do at some point need to bring it back to, but what happens when under what conditions do this then arise again? But thank you for writing such a great book, because I've learned a lot from it. So.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I want to start by saying, well, thank you very much to David. Thank you very much to Anthony for writing this book. I also learnt a huge amount from it, and I think it's really a work of outstanding scholarship. I think it gives us fresh perspectives, not just on the subject of Jews and violence in the Middle Ages. I think it doesn't just take a hard look at the politics of interpreting representations of hostility to Jews, but I think it also, and this is where I most benefited, suggests some approaches to reading cultural representations of Jews that has resonance way beyond the Middle Ages, and I think that's really an enormous achievement. So I want to say, first of all, a few things about the book itself, and then I want to think about the ways that it actually has resonance with my own work in the 19th century. Well, I think, first of all, this book makes some very important, insightful, challenging interventions into what have become unquestioned truisms in many academic and popular accounts of medieval anti-Semitism. Because, first of all, Anthony demonstrates that there's a difference between the persecutory violence enacted on the Jews in the late Middle Ages and the textualization of violence, which had specific and quite different uses. And also what he doesn't do is to regard violence as some sort of metaphor or a displacement, or represented violence as a kind of metaphor or displacement. He wants to understand it as vividly felt violence, actually experienced violence. And I think that's related to another important aspect of this book, which is that I suppose we take seriously the centrality in medieval religious culture of pain and violence, seen on its own terms, rather than as a kind of screen for something else, whether that's social relations or psychic anxiety. Anthony mentioned this in his introduction. Cultural representations of Jews are often an opportunity for a kind of bland historical triumphalism. What we get time and time again is this kind of self-congratulatory pleasure that academics take in ticking off the past for its very reprehensible narrow-mindedness. Representations of Jews serve that quite regularly. But I think what Anthony's doing is bringing us closer to those writers and those readers. Rather than extending the difference, he's bringing us closer. He's bringing us closer to the richness, to the complexity of their experience of religion. And especially those aspects, he's most interested here in pain and in fear, which are especially aspects, I think, that are unfamiliar to us now. And which he repeatedly uses the phrase in his book, for the term in his book, he uses the term welcomed. These aspects were welcomed into medieval lives. And I think he's also very good at squelching some of the least useful categories of analysis that have been used to analyse literary discourse produced in multi-faith contexts. And I think what he just talked about, showing you both Christian representations of Jews and Jewish representations. I'd have liked to have seen even more of that, really, because what it really showed me, and I think this echoed and resonated for me in the period that I work on too, is the high degree of intertextual mobility between narratives, rhetorics, and images of suffering within Jewish and Christian texts. In fact, what this means is that it's very difficult to talk about Christian and Jewish texts in quite such an obvious and transparent way. I think that's a formative and very, very important intervention. And I think looking at those representations of pain and suffering in the hunt, in the Haggadah that Anthony just showed us, also I think challenges the idea that Jewish representations of what may seem to be Jews are necessarily resistive in some way, that they enter into some sort of resistive dialogue with dominant discourses. In fact, I think what he's showing is they have their own dynamic, they have their own aesthetics, they have their own poetics that doesn't necessarily refer to and can't be read off from their immediate experience. I think what I took from this example also is the very important point that the literary record of Jewish suffering, in fact, paradoxically, in this example reflects a position of relative security. It's not about Jewish vulnerability, even though it is an image of vulnerability. And I think that takes me to the final point that I want to heap praise on, which I think is the attention that Anthony's drawing to the uses today of scholarship on anti-Semitism. And as he's shown and said again here in the book, accounts of hostility to Jews that construct a seamless thread through the centuries anachronistically collapse the radically different kinds of meanings that are attached to Jews and the uses to which images of Jews and their roles and actions have been put in different times and places. And I think, furthermore, the notion of eternal anti-Semitism is now increasingly driven by ideology, and it's used to underpin a belief that Jews in Israel and the diaspora are exceptionally and perpetually vulnerable. But if, however, we read representations of violence against Jews as in some ways quite different from that, part of a religious culture designed to induce affective experiences of edifying fear and pain, that's something really very different. I think it becomes much harder to instrumentalize such representations of Jews as some sort of warning from history. Now, my work on cultural representations of Jews in the early Victorian period in England is also essentially concerned with imaginary Jews. Of course, Anthony's right in saying that the period that he works on is exceptional in that there were literally no Jews officially present. One might say that there's something sort of relatively similar going on in the early 19th century in Britain, where the Jewish population was extremely small. This is, of course, way before the years of mass migration at the end of the century. So the Jewish population was, in actual fact, was very small, and it was also very low profile. But, nonetheless, images of Jews, and especially of Jewesses, abounded in popular literature. So that's interesting. That's sort of where I began my research on this question. What's that all about? I think the popularity of imaginary Jewesses is important for two reasons. And firstly, because it just doesn't fit that prevailing scholarly paradigm of the repetition, the endless repetition of anti-Semitic imagery. And the 19th century can be mined for anti-Semitic imagery. There's plenty of it. But there's also this other story that was never really talked about. It doesn't fit, it's not hostile. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So, what does that tell us? What are we supposed to do with images that are not hostile, but are nonetheless thoroughly imaginary. And I think, secondly, there were resonances between Anthony's book and my own work in recognising that 19th century Jewesses, the key imaginary Jews of the 19th century, were invariably caught up with actually very similar sort of affective themes, those of torment, suffering, and also of reading. So this, back here, is Zoraide. I think that's how you say her name, but that's another imaginary name, I think, imaginary Jewish name. She's the heroine. She's the one lying down. Although it's quite important that there's not a great deal of distinction between the bodies and faces of these two women here. Okay, so the one lying down is Zoraide, who's the heroine of Annie Webb's popular historical novel Julemerk, or A Tale of the Nestorians, which was first published in 1849 and reprinted many times. Webb was an extremely popular, not popular novelist. Many of her works were reprinted countless times, in fact. Now, Zoraide here is in an attitude typical of countless literary representations of Jewesses in the 19th century. She's expiring. And her death comes at the end of a long struggle, long psychic struggle and physical struggle, which begins with her discontent with her Jewish family. Novels about Jewesses frequently harped on this theme, highlighting especially the patriarchal nature of the family and the threat that that oppressed Jewesses of forced marriage. So another example, Madame Brendler's novel Tales of a Jewess, published in 1838. In this novel, the sensitive Jewish heroine is oppressed by her father, harassed by a lecherous rabbi who lives in her family, and invariably, in this case as in many others, the Jewess turns to Christianity. She's often abetted and supported in this by a female friend, and she begins to read the Bible, the New Testament that is, in secret. Then the drama intensifies. The Jewess becomes the victim of dramatic psychological and physical persecution. In the fictional memoirs of Lila Ada, another Jewess story published in the 1840s, the heroine is subjected to a 7-hour interrogation at which a group of rabbis hit her, spit in her face, and excommunicate her. Sounds familiar? What we see in these texts is a reiteration of the figure of the persecuting Jew, with the Jewess in the role of Jesus. So, in all of these texts, the suffering of the Jewess becomes her apotheosis. In another of Annie Webb's novels, the heroine Naomi, whose apostasy forces her into an embattled relationship with her parents, and this is how she's described. Anxiety and sorrow had already left their traces on her form and face and quenched the brilliance of her clear black eye. But she was more lovely and more interesting in her patient grief than she had been in the pride of her joyous youth. So these texts frequently draw the reader to take pleasure in the particular beauty of the Jewess's suffering. In Anti-Semite and Jew, published in 1946, Jean-Paul Sartre sought to establish a firm link between 19th century literary representations of the Jewess and the violence enacted upon the bodies of European Jews. He wrote, "There is in the words 'a beautiful Jewess' a very special sexual signification, one quite different from that contained in the words 'beautiful Romanian,' 'beautiful Greek,' or 'beautiful American,' for example. This phrase carries an aura of rape and massacre. The beautiful Jewess is she whom the Cossacks under the Tsars dragged by her hair through the streets of her burning village." Now, this is a striking example of what critics usually, with regard to the Holocaust, and obviously that's kind of shadowing what Sartre is writing here, what they call backshadowing, which is to say reading textual representations with historical hindsight. So that for Sartre, the idea of the Jewess's beauty and even the term always invokes and, in fact, perhaps provokes the sadistic erasure of Jews. However, Sartre's location of that language of Jewish representation in that particular context that he comes from, I think that obscures the more complex religious function of the relationship between suffering and beauty for the 19th century consumers of these texts. The novels I've been describing, this is a key example, were produced by Protestant evangelical writers as part of the hugely popular campaign to convert the Jews in Victorian England. The imaginary Jewess served a symbolic function for evangelical Protestants because the Jews were to play a central role in their eschatological scheme. And these narratives also gave expression to the paradoxical place of Judaism within Protestant theology. So Judaism figured as the foil to Christianity, but at the same time, it was also a source of profound identification for Protestants, and particularly for evangelical Protestants. And so what you get is this bifurcation of the Jews into, on the one hand, cruel, persecuting Jewish men, and on the other hand, patient, sensitive, redeemable Jewish women with whom one might identify. So fired with millennial expectation, Protestants who believed they had not historically persecuted the Jews, they had a different kind of historical relationship to the Jews, and they were being enjoined now to persuade the Jews to conversion. And this would be the crucial factor in hastening the second coming of Christ. And women in particular had a special role to play in this because under evangelical ideology, women were believed to be more spiritual, more capable of emulating Christ's humility, more capable of embodying his mission. So what you see here in this picture is Zoraide supported by her Christian friend Helena. And Helena is engaged in just such an act of portentous conversion. So indeed, women were, in fact, very especially zealous and active in this campaign to convert the Jews. In conversion societies, and there were many, many, many across the country in all kinds of obscure places that you wouldn't expect, women didn't tend to have positions of authority in the institutional structures of conversion, but they did do a lot of fundraising and copywriting. And it was they who produced texts like this prolifically. And it was through reading that I want to argue that the vast majority of women activists, and of course these were women who very, very likely had never even seen a Jew, let alone met one or attempted to convert one. So it was through reading that these women could experience and enact the kind of key spiritual virtues that were accorded to them as women in evangelical culture. And those key virtues were pity and patience. So readers were not being encouraged to feel the wounds of Christ in their own body in the way that the text Antony studies were. But what they were being exhorted to do was to have a more kind of novelistic experience. They were engaged in the more novelistic practices of identification and sympathy. So the author, for example, of a fundraising tract for the London Society for Promoting Christianity Amongst the Jews, which is a very key conversion society, the author implored in this text, does not every female in happier circumstances feel herself called upon to attend to her perishing sister when she says, "Oh, pity me, for the hand of God hath touched me"? So through lectures and fundraising and distributing tracts and countless periodicals and novels, a massive literary culture of this kind, this campaign proliferated, but it invoked a huge community as well of writers and readers. It was, in actual fact, a complete failure, or an almost complete failure. It didn't pose anything like the kind of threat that it wanted or claimed to do. So we have to ask ourselves, why did they continue to publish these books? Why did they continue to read them? The persistence of conversionist publication in the face of that failure, the face of that ostensible goal, I think suggests that really what was going on was something quite different. Something that was in fact very successful. Imagining Jews for these writers and readers was a very effective way of speaking about and to Christians, and especially to Christian women. In the early 19th century, evangelicals had a problem. They needed to provide some sort of adequate leisure opportunities for to enter into competition with the temptations of the burgeoning marketed novels. Appropriately pious reading material for women was a particular problem. There was a lot of writing about the temptations of worldly fiction. So stories of conversion could serve that market. Stories of conversion had an inherently novelistic narrative, and they provided a convenient diversion from the danger of worldly fiction. And in these texts, the autonomy experienced by the secret reading subject, the woman with her book on her own, is transformed into a source of religious potential rather than anxiety. So the first turning point in a conversion memoir or novel is invariably the scene where the woman reader encounters a New Testament in a private space where she's isolated from the influence of her family. So the heroine of Tales of a Jewess, for example, experiences revelation in her locked room in silent communion with the Word. And amongst her Jewish family, she feels an instinctive longing to be alone again. This is what the text says, alone again to open that forbidden book which she could not overcome. In these texts, reading, writing, and feeling become aspects of the Protestant emphasis on interiority, on private faith, and on Bible reading. And these are seen as specific acts of insurrection against the communal familial, legalistic ethos of the Jewish family. And so you can see here, this is actually a very, very happy death scene, because finally, at the centre of it, where is your eye being led to? Your eye is being led to the book. The book has finally come out of the closet. It's out there, shared between the two women. So in staging scenes of reading in this way, conversion narratives steer the reading experience of their own readers. The Protestant woman reader becomes the Jewess, reenacting her own spiritual struggle through that of the imaginary Jewess. And we can see this intense emotive intimacy between the reader and the Jewess in the novel, Jula Merck, where Zoraide's suffering and transfiguration becomes transferred onto her Christian friend too. So conversion becomes shared ecstatically between the women. This is what the novel says. Helena's anxiety to lay open to the Jewess the inexhaustible stores of comfort which are contained in the inspired word, and to bring her to a perfect confidence in God's love and mercy, and a perfect resignation to his will, had caused her to search that word with even greater care and diligence than she'd ever employed before. And the necessary result was an increased steadfastness in her own faith and a greater enjoyment of peace in her own soul. So in this scene, Zoraide's martyrdom transfigures her Jewishness. Her drawn-out, beautiful, exemplary dying strengthens the faith of her friend, Helena, and inspires the conversion of a bunch of unbelieving relatives as well. Now, this scene has been described by one critic as the demonstration of a kind of desire for the erasure of Judaism. But I think that's to completely misread it, because in context, what we can see going on here is the reader dwelling on the exceptional striving, suffering, and reward in Christian faith. As a woman, the Jewess, like the reader, was seen to be more amenable to the conversion of the heart. The woman reader was exhorted in these texts to identify with the suffering of the Jewess, as with Christ persecuted by the Jews. In the story of conversion, she could read an allegory of her own spiritual rebirth. And in their narratives, frequent recommendations that the heroine should turn away from the authority of fathers, of husbands, of rabbis, and attend to her own conscience. That woman reader could recognise her own sense of struggling moral righteousness in the face of dominant conceptions of modest femininity. So the rebellion of the Jewess alluded to the emergent social and political discontents of women readers in this period, but her submission to a higher authority cast her story within a safely orthodox conservative framework. So the textual representation of the Jewess, then, was a vehicle for the articulation of middle-class female identity and an invocation of female religious community. And that's it.
All three of you. It's sort of one of the stock phrases that sort of chair people come out with at the moment. It's like there's lots of food for thought there, but actually it's more like a feast for thought than food for thought. I mean, I think that I'll just say that sort of one of the strongest themes which came out in a sense across all three of the presentations was the tension, if you like, between trying to distinguish between a real persecutory violence and real and as it were, social interactions between Jews and non-Jews, and the ways in which those actions and that violence is textualized, and the importance of contextualizing in cultural contexts which might not be immediately anything to do with Jews. How those textualizations occur. So, I mean, if that is on the one hand, and that is extremely, as I think came out extremely well, is extremely challenging in the face of both historical and literary scholarship, which wants to emphasize the both the timelessness and the transparency of anti-Semitism. I think that's extremely important, extremely provocative, but on the other hand, how then does one relate that to, as it were, those moments when textual violence becomes real violence, and that, if you like, is one of the tensions which came through these extremely interesting presentations. But I think now, rather than me add a fourth presentation, I think we should open it up to sort of comments or questions. Yes.
I have a question on anti-Semitism. Because you talk about the history of anti-Semitism, but if you take it right now, how do you combat anti-Semitism when it comes from right wings or extremists? It is fine to reject it. But when it comes from eminent scholar, I read the book of Stephen Walt and John Mearsheimer, which title is The Israel Lobby, and they claim that there is a lobby in the US that press Americans to take policy that is against the interest of the United States. And you also have a book from Jimmy Carter, which says that the title is Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid. So people will tend to read this book, and because their writers are eminent, are well respected, they will go into it and tend to believe. So how do you combat this type of anti-Semitism?
Thank you. Perhaps we can gather a number of questions and comments. Or yes.
Well, what I was interesting, I was trying to sort of find themes that pervaded all your presentations, which I very much enjoyed. And two areas that I sort of think of mostly was one, it's, for example, like this depiction here, is the rejection of Judaism. and it's the importance of validating Christianity. And that validation, of course, becomes scholarly, becomes culturally expressed in books and documents. And of course, that links in eventually to the sort of cruel victimization or persecution, which really can't exist in a vacuum, but of course has to originate in some cultural, academic or intellectual anti-Semitism. On your first presentation, I was interested in when you were talking about after 1290, and of course the validation of Christianity I felt was very much linked to what was happening in the Crusades. There was raising money in Europe for this continued struggle, liberating the Holy Land, and of course that required not just the validation but also the denigration of the other. And I felt that was perhaps the sort of continuous theme in all your presentations. It's become very iconographic, and of course in the Haggadah that would have been only produced for those areas of population who could read, who chiefly concerned with churches, with perhaps monarchs, and that the particular scene I was interested in, where he was shooting the hare, which is quite a cruel sort of depiction, and I was reading the Hebrew, and it says it was Ki le'olam chasto, which is for your kindness lives forever, and it was so contrasting, and it was sort of paradoxical. So I was just interested in whether you felt that there was that continuing, that the sort of the theme pervaded all your presentations.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I've just throw a couple of things out there. I mean, first of all, just picking on the two first presentations, and thinking a bit more about the interactions between Marian devotion and anti-Jewish rhetoric, and then how that might in turn relate to these 19th century depictions, which also focus on female spirituality, if there is perhaps further links to tease out there. And then the other point was about sort of micro context and what happens to these books in a kind of post-medieval world, who read and owned them in a later period.
Do you want to respond to these questions first, and then we can gather up another set?
So to the first question, I mean, I would use the continual get out clause of being a medievalist, and I don't go past 1509. So, but I would say. To your question, which is, I mean, there is a politics to the work I do, which Nadia brought out, that as scholars of the past, we shouldn't really be concerned with ticking off the past, as Nadia said, and judging the past. We're interested in understanding the past and interpreting it, and that has its own politics based on our perspective, obviously. But one of the points that John made me think about an article I was reading the other day by Jacques Rancière, who is one of the kind of foremost French public intellectuals. And I can't remember the exact title, but it was something like top-down hatred or hatred from the top or something like that. And he argues about contemporary Islamophobia in France, that this idea of there being a mob is totally wrong. Actually, hatred comes from authorities. It comes from the press, it comes from cultural authorities and that kind of thing. And this made me think about the question John asked about prestige and who's actually exposed to this material. And yeah, in the period I work on, it is usually literate, wealthy, people who've got enough time on their hands to be producing and consuming luxurious devotional books or that kind of thing. But there is a public impetus to it. In some of the stuff I look at in my book, things like stained glass or tiles or wall paintings, this is clearly about teaching people who would not necessarily be exposed to the literate element of it, but to the very basic moral. And that's where lots of this anti-Semitic imagery comes in, getting a kernel of contrast and pain, which distills, and that's true also for the Haggadah, it distills a very complicated and interesting story into these key moments of pain. Okay, sorry, I've forgotten where I was going with that. There was a question about what happens to these books after the Middle Ages. With the with the Jewish books, this is actually very interesting. In England, the Jews' books, lots of them were bought by Christian monasteries and used for the learning of Hebrew to better to understand the Jewish scriptures. So there's that interesting foundational role of books that could only be made in England by Jews then being useful for Christians. Elsewhere, the Jewish books were cut up and used in binding Christian books, but it's very interesting what happens to them and who decides to keep them and who decides what not to keep. Do you want to?
I'm brewing a cold, so my brain's not working terribly fast now. But I'm two things to say which come out of the questions asked, although they may not be directly responding to any of them. One is the thought of how to combat anti-Semitisms, I will say generally. I don't know. I mean, as a sort of overarching question, I don't know. I mean, if I knew the answer of how to stop people saying hateful things about each other, that would be miraculous. But I think what you can do as an historian is you can historicise anti-Semitisms, and that both complicates the narrative, as Anthony's work does, complicates the narrative of saying that it isn't just exactly the same thing throughout time. It does different things in different periods, and that will have, some groups will feel good about that and some won't. But at the same time, it also challenges those who want to draw upon what they perceive to be a sort of 2,000-year hateful narrative, which they think is true against Jews, to say, well, no, you what they think they're drawing upon, by historicising it, you can say, well, look, obviously these stories are told in context, and how can you possibly think this is therefore authoritative when you can see it in all of these different things? So historicising, I don't think it's a balm to all human ills, but I do think it's a powerful way of making people confront what it is they're actually dealing with in the here and now, rather than sort of, reading the past into the present in a way that stops them being able to communicate with regard to the future. The other thing, then, though, is about, at the same time, I think you mentioned inheritance and the sort of that sense of, it's not that each past is then, completely separated off from the next past that comes after it. And I mean, it seems to me that what must be the case is that stories of identity, and including stories of hatred which form different identity groups, I don't know if that they have necessary and inescapable consequences, or either, in fact, no, I'm certain that they don't, because the point is that, again, I go back to southern France in the 13th century. It's absolutely clear that in southern France in the 13th century, you as a Christian listening to Christian preaching would have heard stories about Jews which, said bad things about Jewish people. At the same time, you had a much better chance of actually knowing some Jewish people in the south of France as a medieval Christian, because there are many more Jewish communities connected, not only in cities but in more rural areas. And it's not the case that in every year, throughout every context, that there is constant violence or hatred or something. Those things somehow, some of the time, could operate in different spaces. At the same time, in some contexts, those stories then come to inform political violence against peoples, and so on. One line of analysis, there's a medievalist called David Nirenberg who wrote a book called Communities of Violence. One line of analysis emphasises very strongly the idea that the contexts are always actually about something else. That is, they're about economics, or often they're about royal power, or these things. And I think that's very interesting, although I do slightly worry whether the context may also be about people who live near each other, something small sparking something larger off. I mean, there are modern occasions of hatred and genocide. One thinks of Rwanda and so on, where again, there are communities that live together that at a certain point no longer live together and kill each other, and I don't know why that happens, but it seems that the relationship of narrative and representation to action is clearly a complex one, but it cannot just be an inescapable consequence, because basically human beings would have killed each other off completely by now.
Yeah, so I suppose I was interested in the denigration, because by denigrating you therefore validate
the other side
from the validator. So I suppose I was looking for the link between the end of medieval and 19th century literature. Right in the middle, you've got your Shylock, you've got in Merchant of Venice, where Jessica runs off, and a Boita father runs off, and she marries a non-Jew. And to me, it's not just perhaps you're talking about this is in this scene here. It's a rejection of that patriarchal environment and atmosphere.
Yes, but it's also actually it's a very strong identification with Judaism as well. So I think it's quite important not to collapse this altogether, because what we have in Protestant Christianity, in fact evangelical Christianity, is a very, very strong identification with the Jews. In fact, we might even call it philo-Semitism. So I think it's important to remember that imaginary Jews are not only hostile representations, and that when we think about the uses of anti-Semitism, we also need to think about the uses of philo-Semitism and idealizations of the Jews. What's being validated here, it's not actually quite so clear.
So are there examples in literature where they are used as a paradigm and used as an example, as much as they are?
And the kind of pliable Jewess is an idea which goes back to the Middle Ages. There's lots of preaching stories about Jewish women who are more easily converted to Christianity than Jewish men, who are all kinds of... there's the Jewess is more like Virgin Mary, the Jewess is more like... there's all kinds of potential seen in the Jewess, which is not seen in the male Jew.
Is that connection to all biblical Eve, who could be turned by sophistry?
I think it's very complicated, but there's an idealization which is also, it's anti-Semitic in the sense that it disesteems the validity of Judaism as a religion, and also there's this sense of the Jewess's bewitching beauty, which is often then turned against her in medieval sources, which I don't know if that comes up in the 19th century, but this as an image has a very long history, but it means very different things in the individual texts. And this seems to be what Abigail in the Jew of Malta and Jessica in the Merchant of Venice kind of feeds on this tradition, but then has other destinations in terms of Protestant ideas about the inheritance of true scripture and that kind of thing.
Natalie, did you want to respond to any of the other?
No. That sort of was a portmanteau response to all of them.
Yes.
I'll keep it simple. Especially to the medievalists, and you seem to be moving towards this. Is there a utility in using the word anti-Semitism because it's anachronistic?
Do you want me to answer that, or should I wait for it?
Let's get some. Okay. Yeah. Did you want to ask?
Sorry, yes. Yes, I wanted to ask about the Lodge of the Psalter. You give the date about 1350. It's about the time of the Black Death.
Yes.
I wondered if there's any connection between flagellation and the Black Death, because of course on the continent flagellants became very widespread and very anti-Jewish after the Black Death. And I wondered also if the representation of the Jews in that flagellation were in order to intensify the moment, because seeing is sensing in the blood count. As with Julian McNorwich, I see the red blood trickling down. But if you actually have the very moment at which the blood is being shed, you have the intensification in terms of devotion on the part of the viewer.
Anyone else? Yes.
I wondered, Anthony was talking about how Jewesses were seen as easier to convert in the Middle Ages. I wondered, are there any Jewesses in the English imagination who are helping English people to feel persecuted, like the Jewish men in the images? And also a question to Nadia about, you said that, again, it was because they were easier to convert and seen in some ways emotional and sensitive, but I wondered, was there any knowledge in the early 19th century about the fact that Jewishness passes through the female line, and therefore converting a Jewish woman might be a more successful way to get more converts?
And so one more question up.
Yeah, I've got a couple of comments that are provoked by your very thoughtful presentations. Firstly, something about the perpetuation of anti-Semitism. I'd like to maybe suggest, and I'm very ignorant in this respect, so you could probably correct me immediately, that you have a perpetual climate of anti-Semitism, in inverted commas, in late medieval England, on the basis that there's something that is reiterated every Easter through festivities, rituals, and the liturgy associated with the Passion. And this is not just it, because you have to think about the audience, and your points are brilliant relating to what audiences are receiving this. You have to think about children, and children being educated through gesture, through admiratio, through gazing, through touching, through associating images of Christ as an object of love. And this is very formative for children growing up within that kind of background. And then to have the object of hatred contrasted very vividly, almost as an animated image, you can imagine that this is something you do not need a Jewish community around you to have that reiterated every year. And then, interestingly, in southern France, when you have these episodes where people get worked up, I still think that you have that simmering reiteration in the background that is, and I don't know if there is any actual material culture evidence for people defacing images, striking images, like we have in Central Europe, very well documented. But this may go all the way through to the preparations leading up to these liturgies. There's some very good ethnography from southern France and Spain, where even the food you choose, and children play a role in preparing food, is permeated with this symbolism. So it's almost there perpetually in your mind. You do not need real Jews to have that in your mind. And maybe this explains the persistence in some respects, because it is an annual ritual. The second very quick point is the role of pilgrimage. We have people coming and going from the country, especially to northern Spain, on a regular basis, being exposed, dealing with, hearing gossip, seeing the actions of particularly fervent religious individuals, perhaps even encountering people who've experienced the Inquisition in northern Spain, and coming back also with these stories of these ideas. Maybe they think they've been swindled or they've dealt with some, but you also have these vivid experiences also being, for adults, maybe more so than for children. But I think the audience is broad and nationwide. But that's, I could be wrong, that's just my suggestion.
Would you like to?
Okay, I'll answer this very briefly because I'm aware that the wine is warming. The question about anti-Semitism, I actually don't use it in my book as exactly for the reasons you use until the end of the book when I kind of discuss its use as a critical term. I think it is very unhelpful as a kind of.
You have to be very careful now.
Yeah, as a term for reading back the past, because it's a value judgment. It's not a neutral term, and so I haven't used it in my way of interpreting the past. So that point's very well taken. Also, the point about the lateral psalter, I absolutely agree with you. It's about intensifying and kind of enhancing the reading experience, and the point you made about being sensory and sensing through vision, I think that's absolutely key to lots of these representations, but not as a kind of ancillary to the text, but actually in tandem with the text, that you're educating yourself, you're educating your eye, you're training your memory through this violence, which then connects to this point about pedagogy and children. And again, I absolutely agree with you, but in the educative role of this, and medieval theories of education are absolutely full of violence. Violence is the best way to hit a child to make him remember something. That's absolutely commonplace in the Middle Ages, and that's aestheticised as well as the real way of that children were instructed in church schools. But there's an abiding interest in the infliction of pain to oneself to remember a complicated lesson, which then kind of connects with kind of flagellation and that kind of thing. I didn't answer the question about the Black Death, but other people have written books about the lateral psalter and its relationship with Black Death, so I will pause there.
I mean, I echo everything Anthony says essentially, I don't think. And I think just picking up on the last part, I think your points are extremely well made. That yes, I think, but the points are extremely well made. That yes, I think, but at the same time, it's still therefore, with one slight caveat, which is the degree to which the Passion narrative focuses upon Jewish persecution of Christ varies over time and in particular place. So there's, that, but yes, but it's there.
Maybe the micro context will then come into play.
That's what. Yeah, that's right. But you see, in as much as your point, in a sense, was to say, but it is also the case that there is a shared European Catholic culture which is in England, is in the continent, and I think I agree. I think basically one of the potentials of that. It has within it, by let's say 1300, it has always the potential to produce and reinforce, amongst other things, images against Jews. But then it's still interesting and intriguing and worth thinking about how that plays out differently in different social contexts, particularly where one social context is large Jewish communities who do a whole variety of things versus small Jewish communities where they're primarily focused in finance, or indeed where there are no Jewish communities whatsoever because they've been driven out. So how that then plays out is worth thinking through, even if it's not the only thing to think about, that shared stuff.
I'm not a medievalist, so I'm not medieval
Well,
questions.
in that case, there are, I think, just 4 things left for me to do. First of all, is to say that those of you whose appetite for Anthony's work has been whetted by this discussion will be able to purchase copies of the book we've been discussing at the radically discounted price of £20, down from £29, and copies are available over here behind me. Secondly, I'd like to thank all of you for attending and for contributing. Thirdly, to say that there is wine awaiting you. I was at a meeting this afternoon which went into in some detail about the financial straits which higher education finds itself in these days, and that's why there might not be as much wine as you would like, but there is wine there nonetheless. And last of all, but most importantly, I'd like to thank all 3 of our speakers for speaking in such a lucid and insightful and often in provocative ways. Thank you very much indeed.